Creative Selection: Inside Apple's Design Process During the Golden Age of Steve Jobs by Kocienda. This is a book summary of a really great book on the design process specifically for software at Apple. Ken worked there for 15 years during the release of Safari, iPhone, and iPad, and he's well known as the developer of the initial iPhone keyboard. And this is a must-read for anyone who is interested in product development or Apple's history. It's also a good book if you are a bit of an A/B split testing skeptic, thinking that the scope of A/B split testing has probably far exceeded its absolute utility in design, and that a lot of really great and innovative design probably doesn't originate with A/B split testing. But more on that later. We're going to go through three things in this post. The first is the two main big key concepts, that of creative selection and that on the importance of demos. Then we'll talk about taste, judgment, and its design and role at Apple. And last, end with specific commentary on Ken's involvement on development of Safari browser, iPhone keyboard, and general comments on working at Apple. All right, part one, creative selection. The title of the book is Creative Selection, and this really comes down to the key theme that the book tries to get across, which is this process of continuous incremental Darwinian evolution that moves something from an idea towards a final process. And this creative selection process is one where one creates a demo, receives specific feedback on the demo, and then produces another demo where they'll receive further feedback. And at each demo, there's the opportunity to select for the best ideas at that time and to potentially introduce new variation or a fresh divergence with the decision to pursue a different approach for the next demo. And this was how Apple built software, one demo after another, improving each time. And Ken highlights in the book what they didn't do as part of this process. They didn't have long coffee breaks, they didn't have long jam sessions or long whiteboarding sessions where they talked about ideas abstractly. They didn't shuffle papers around waiting for an epiphany and inspiration that would magically get them to a final product. In short, they didn't try to flip Thomas Edison's ratio of inspiration to perspiration. Thomas Edison was famous for saying that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And as Ken points out, Edison probably wasn't trying to communicate a universal mathematical rule, but for fun, he actually went and calculated the amount of time for one of their projects on the Safari web browser, how much of it was inspiration and how much of it was perspiration, and found that Edison's rule that the perspiration is at least 99% definitely holds up, and it's probably higher. In an example with Edison, he may have had the inspiration to use bamboo as the filament for the light bulb, but then he had to test over 1,200 different types of bamboo to find the optimal one that worked. And now let's move into talking about demos, because demos really are what the core part of creative selection. And the big takeaway is that, from what I can tell, the fundamental way that Ken worked at Apple was the creation of one demo after another demo after another demo. And without having a demo, it's really difficult to discuss and compare ideas or to receive feedback. And Ken gives a simple example of asking someone to think of a cute dog, or asking two people to each think of a cute dog. This is a pretty simple thing to think of. It's a simple concept. But without a concrete demo, it's very difficult to compare two people's ideas on what a cute dog is. But the moment that each person produces a picture of a cute dog, a proper discussion can take place where we can have clear commentary and clear feedback, and we can now have progress moving forward. And now imagine how tough it is to try to discuss an idea which is much more abstract or much more complicated than that of a cute dog. Without a demo, it's really impossible, and you need the demo to be able to have multiple designs, to compare the merits of each, and to have concrete discussion, debate, and to choose the best idea at that time and move forward. And so ultimately, this continuous production of demos keeps people focused, it prevents abstract distractions from getting in the way, And it's not a single step which will ever get you to the final product, but it's the incremental improvement upon previous demos. And so to summarize, there are 5 purposes of demos, as Ken illustrates. The first is to highlight potential. Second, to explore concepts. Third, to show progress. 4, to prompt discussion. And 5, to drive the discussion for making software. A few other points here on demoing at Apple. Good demos would move up a series of command being shown at higher levels of management. And so eventually demos would get to Scott, who would make the final decision if the demo is ready or good enough to be shown to Steve. And at a demo, everyone present would be able to contribute their feedback. Demos typically to your peers or at lower levels in the organization, maybe for general feedback, but typically a key part of demoing is that there's always a decider. There's someone who's ultimately in charge of the demo who has to make the final call of what the next step will be. And they may decide to commit, yeps, this is good, go ahead. They may decide to make a change, make these changes and come back, or they may decide to reject and dislike the demos entirely with a thought that none of them are good enough, and for the next demo, come back with something new. Another advantage of demos is they allow the creator to gauge people's genuine reaction when using the product. They should be built like a Hollywood backlot, where parts of the demo are facades and actually don't work, but those parts of the demo which the user is being asked to interact with, and that's the focus of the demo, they require a higher level of reality. And so in the end, the person interacting with the demo doesn't know what is a thin backlot, what is actually real, and therefore they're able to suspend disbelief and believe that the entire demo is real. Now, of course, the reason to use the demo is because it's much quicker to build a demo than to build a full piece of functioning software. And so similar to a Hollywood backlot, which doesn't build full buildings, when you could use a facade instead to be able to communicate the same idea. And so use the demo to, quote, start approximating your end goal as quickly as possible, end quote. Demos advance the story. They make us react. They're the catalyst for creative decisions. And most demos, almost all of them, fail. So get over the apprehension of failure, Ken encourages us, because that is essentially the norm for demos. And ultimately, more demos mean more feedback. And as he says, demos make discussion of things that are complicated easy. They make it easier to make decisions. Now, what was it like to demo for Steve Jobs? Ken recalls a few examples of doing this. Steve would review these demos in a boardroom called Diplomacy, and above the entrance to the room there was a sign that said, "Know thyself." And he describes the experience of going to demo for Steve almost like going to see the oracle, who would speak and decide, and he would make the final decision of what Apple would commit to. Now, of course, Steve Jobs, through bios and different sources, has been well known to have changed his mind from time to time, to contradict previous opinions of his own. But I kind of like Steve's summary where he says that although the mood and response of Steve Jobs was unpredictable, his passion was predictable, and he wanted it to be great. And so although he respected Steve's taste, he didn't respect his temperament. From Ken's description, when a demo was placed in front of Steve Jobs, he would study it very intently, carefully surveying it from all angles, and then he might ask a question. And the question was actually in some ways meant as a test to see how people responded. And if you passed the test, essentially, Steve could trust you that you'd be able to make good decisions that would help make the software better. And ultimately, the people who Steve brought closest around him were people who had a history of being able to make good decisions that were in line with what Steve's vision was. Ultimately, Steve would make the final call, whether to commit, whether to give specific feedback for changes, or to ask for something entirely new at the next demo. We move on now to some of the tools for selection. And this is a list of 7 key processes in the creative process at Apple. And these were not explicitly talked about or highlighted, but something that Ken put together retrospectively after working there. The first is the importance of inspiration from past work. The second is collaborating and working with others. The third is craft, which is skills to achieve high-quality results. The fourth is diligence and the hard work required to get something done without taking shortcuts. The fifth is decisiveness and the importance of not delaying or procrastinating and being able to be decisive in favor of simplicity. Sixth is taste, which he defines as a refined sense of judgment. And seven is empathy, where you see the world from other people's perspective. And one of the key design ethoses that was emphasized by Steve Jobs was that of one in favor of simplicity. And a decision that added complexity back into a design was generally considered bad. This was bad for the end user and the person who was using the product because it made their life more difficult. It was more difficult for then the developers and the designers because they had to figure out how to deal with the increased complexity of the new design. And so ultimately, simplicity was favored with the importance that software should speak for itself. Nobody would be there when the user first used it on their own to teach them how to use the software. Ken highlights one of the great Steve Jobs quotations about design is how it works. The larger quotation comes from the text where Steve said, "Most people make the mistake of thinking design is what it looks like. People think it's the veneer, that the designers are handed this box and told, make it look good. This is not what we think design is. It's not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works." And Ken had a few lines in the book where I would quote him. He wrote, "Objects should explain themselves. The appearance of a product should tell you what it is and how to use it. Shallow beauty in products does not serve people." Objects should explain themselves actually said it's almost something, or objects should explain themselves almost sounds something like Dieter Rams would say, but it's a key fundamental part of this process. And we now turn to the concepts of taste, judgment, and balance. And taste is defined by Ken as developing a refined sense of judgment and finding balance that produces a pleasing and integrated whole. And taste is put in the purpose of design. And we said design is how something works. So taste isn't something arbitrary and taste isn't something self-indulgent, but taste, which is developing the sense of refined judgment and balance, is always being put at the service of design, and design is how something works. And so ultimately, what is important is the process of how one develops their sense of judgment. And it's very interesting because Ken essentially describes the exact same process that I've stumbled upon myself over the years. And that's that one needs to be able to develop a like response, which is an intuitive gut response that someone has when they see something new. He says, quote, "This refined like response results in the ability to form opinions with your gut and then justify them with your head." And then I entirely agree with this. And the importance is that you need to build trust in this refined like response. And that takes time. And you need to ultimately see a catalog of things over the course of your career that you like and use this as a measuring stick when you compare new ideas against it. And this is critical because the development of taste and judgment allow you to keep making progress. You can't open yourself, Ken writes, to an infinite possibilities at every step, which we'll get to in a minute when we talk about A/B testing. But ultimately, each small judgment about taste in the pursuit of design, which is how something works, has to come together into an integrated whole. And when this is done poorly, the product becomes off balance. And the ability to integrate multiple judgments together based on balance of taste and empathy for the user is an integrative experience. And this is why we get now into A/B testing and heuristics. See, many of the decisions that go into the final product are heuristics or subjective decisions based on taste. And for instance, the final product may use an algorithm which centers a photo on a page, but exactly how long the animation should be for that photo to open is essentially a subjective heuristic. And too many designers, it seems these days, insist that the design calls, which should be heuristics, should be turned into algorithms, a numerical outcome that they test for. But the trouble is that when you reduce every single design decision into a numerical number that you test for, you lose the ability to integrate the overall design and balance of a product. It also takes a lot of time to do all this, what we would call A/B split testing, and this slows down your ability to actually make progress. And it's probably really difficult to create excellent design simply based off of A/B testing of small ideas. And so Ken writes, at Apple, we would have never dreamed of doing that. This is split testing. And we never staged any A/B tests for any of the software on the iPhone. When it came to choosing a color, we picked one. We used good taste and our knowledge of how to make software accessible to people with visual difficulties related to color perception. And we moved on. There's another great quotation here from Douglas Bowman. I'll read, this is from his blog in 2009 on why he left Google. He says, when I joined Google as its first visual designer, the company was already 7 years old. 7 years is a long time to run a company without a classically trained designer. Google had plenty of designers on staff then, but none of them had backgrounds, but they all had backgrounds mostly in computer science or human-computer interface. Without a person at or near the helm who thoroughly understands the principles and elements of design, a company eventually runs out of reasons for design decisions. And he goes on to write later that it's true, a team at Google couldn't decide between two blues, so they tested 41 shades between each blue to see which one performs better. And I had a recent debate over whether a border should be 3, 4, or 5 pixels wide and was asked to prove my case. I can't operate in an environment like that. I've grown tired of debating such minuscule design decisions. There are more exciting design problems in the world to tackle. I won't miss a design philosophy that lives or dies strictly by the sword of data. And so the overall summary of this is that while Ken was at Apple, they put their faith in their sense of taste, which they had developed over time, and this allowed them to make small design decisions and continue to move forward. They didn't have to test everything using external official A/B split testing, and that would have slowed down much of their design process, and they feel for most of this not actually affected the outcome or being able to help produce an excellent product. Now, some of the times the deciding of what the correct threshold should be for a heuristic took time. For instance, knowing exactly when autocorrect should kick in and when it shouldn't kick in was really based on how people used the product during its development stage. But again, this was based off of people's subjective opinion on when they felt this feature should activate and when this feature shouldn't activate. They didn't perform a mathematical test to determine it. In the end, Apple worked to select for the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. Steve Jobs has the quotation which says, "We've always tried to be at the intersection of technology and liberal arts, to be able to get the best of both worlds, to make extremely advanced products from a technology point of view, but also have them to be intuitive, easy to use, fun to use, so that they really fit the users. The users don't have to come to them. They come to the user." Now, in the last third of this post, I'd like to focus on some of the specific projects that Ken worked on. First, the Safari web browser. So the Mac had been using since 1997 Internet Explorer, And Ken was brought on as part of a 3-person team to ultimately create Apple's own web browser. And what they first tried doing was taking open source web browser technology such as Mozilla and running it on the Mac. Now, they first tried Mozilla, and it has 1.5 million lines of code, which if you printed 30 lines per page would mean you have 50,000 pages. And this was near impossible to work with. And then Richard Stallman came along after Ken and Don Milton had been working on this for 6 weeks and essentially said, what have you guys been doing? And then within 2 days had a demo of a web browser running on a Mac. And the way he pulled this off was he used Conquer, which was a much simpler code base. It only had 120,000 lines of code, so 1/10 the size of Mozilla. And Ken uses this as an example on how you can have superhuman progress early on in a project. In the physical world, such as in the Olympics, you can't have one expert who is 10 times or 30 times better than other experts in their field. But at the very early stage of a project, when you don't have constraints in place, and when you're trying to set up the initial organizing principles and concepts, there is the potential for certain expert geniuses, such as Richard Stallman, to be able to provide an insight which is able to essentially do more than 6 weeks worth of work in less than 2 days, as he did with the browser. When they were working on the browser project, they ended up focusing on a single metric, which was page load time, or how long it took to see the browser page load. And any change to the code had to reflect an increase in the page load time, meaning that a decrease, meaning that it gets quicker each time. And if the new code that wanted to be added was absolutely critical, the function that it was going to add to the software, but resulted in the page load becoming slower, what they would have to do is they would have to find other parts of the code that they could optimize the loading time of, so that in the end, when they committed the net amount of these features, that at least was net neutral on page load time. And this page load time benchmark was enforced ruthlessly with code changes, but allowed them to slowly, over time, get the browser working quicker and quicker and quicker, which was a key part of Safari's initial success. And it's important to underscore that page load time was a real-world performance metric which users cared about. And sometimes when people look at code optimization, they don't correlate the code optimization to actual real-world performance metrics, which is the key way to do it. People might look at comparing code optimization to total number of lines of code. Other names were proposed for the Safari web browser, such as Alexander, Freedom, and Thunder. But from the way Ken described it, it seemed actually different people working at Apple would propose some different names, and then eventually Safari was arrived at. And when he came back later to work on HTML text editors for email, he comments on the fact that the insertion point problem, being able to display an insertion point at the end of a line, actually was the most difficult technical problem he ever worked on, which is a bit counterintuitive given how simple it sounds like. We move now on to the iPhone keyboard, and you really need to read the book in order to understand the story. It goes through incredible detail over quite a number of pages with a lot of illustrations. And the short form of it is that it soon became apparent that the keyboard demo that was being demoed on the early iPhone was so bad that it had, quote, product-killing potential. And so, therefore, there was a keyboard derby where staff were essentially told to stop what they're doing, design keyboards, and Ken won that event. And then he would go on to the next 2 years to continuing to refine the keyboard, and it goes through a number of different iterations from how many letters are on each key, how the keys are arranged. A whole bunch of new technologies are developed as far as different letter weighting score patterns, pattern skew algorithms. We know that eventually they decided to settle on a model where each letter had its own button, but the area underneath that you could tap to know that you were tapping on the correct key was based off of the other keys you were pressing, so that ultimately the keyboard you could enter almost garbage on, but then it would know the keys that you thought you wanted to type, and therefore would know the word you actually were trying to type. You need to read the whole thing yourself. It's a really great story. A few big takeaways. In the end, they decided to settle on the QWERTY keyboard arrangement, mostly because it evoked no reaction when they gave it to users. When you showed users alternative keyboard arrangements, it evoked too much of a reaction, and this meant that it was too hard to initially use when you first picked it up. And that's why QWERTY was decided. And the initial iPhone actually could handle 11 multi-touch points at once, although only 2 were used. And so in order to actually activate all 11, you would have had to use 10 fingers in your nose. The size of the app icons on the home screen were determined based on a game. The developers in the office would play this game where it would render squares of different sizes on different parts of the screen, and then collect metrics as users try to click each square. And so 57 pixels was determined as the optimal size for this. And there's a lot of other adaptations if you read through the initial 300-page iPhone patent, which is really a very interesting document. But for instance, when you tap an icon on the screen, you think you're pressing it with your fingertips. But in fact, the part of your finger making contact is slightly below your fingertip. And so the iPhone automatically always adjusts for this. And that sound which you hear when you have your audio on as you type is that of a pencil clacking on a desk. And Ken got the idea from this when he was thinking of Ben Burke, who did the initial sound design for Star Wars, and they made the blaster sounds from a hammer striking a guide wire. Again, trying to make a sound which imitates almost the real-world object. A few last thoughts on working at Apple from Ken. Most projects had someone who was called the DRI, or the directly responsible individual. This was the person who ultimately signed up and was responsible for that product and software and making sure it got done. They worked in very small groups. There was only 7 to 9 people on the initial Safari web browser, and there was only 25 people listed on the inventors of the iPhone patent. And one of the things which is important is that when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he removed the separation between the research and development arms and the software development wing. So therefore, what happened is that the research would now be done by the same people who had to implement the software. And a few other just random notes on software development which were commented on. Ken suggests that you make progress by skipping past problems you can't solve and you move on to the ones you can. There's a period of time before a launch called convergence, which is where you continuously try to drop the number of bugs in your software as you are about to release the project. But Netscape knew that, of course, you can never get to 0 bugs entirely, and so Netscape aimed instead to get to 0 boobs. Play on the word bugs and error in that. If you have a piece of software and you're unable to determine the mysterious behavior of it, this might be that you're looking for a Heisenbug and that the bug hasn't yet been found. And I like his description of someone who's called a seagull manager. And this is, to quote the book, a top-level executive who is rarely around, who flies in occasionally and unexpectedly from who knows where, lands on your beach, squawks noisily, flaps its wings all over the place, and then launches back up into the air, circles overhead, drops a big poop on everyone, and flies away, leaving the rest of the team to clean up the mess, figure out what it all meant, and wonder what to do about the inevitable follow-up visit. And so at Apple, it doesn't sound like they had these types of managers. If you did have high-level managers who were involved in making key decisions, they were ultimately also intimately involved with the projects. And so that brings us to the end of the book. I found that it was really great read. The importance of demos as a work process in this process of creative selection was important takeaway for me. Trying to think about things less abstractly and spend less time working in the abstract layer and more time working in building concrete demos will be certainly a takeaway as I move forward. And I also like the vindication that not everybody sees that A/B testing as the way to design everything. I agree, of course, A/B testing has certain particular utility, especially when trying to maximize critical parts of a user interface, which are have a direct relationship to a bottom line and to a particular outcome which has to be achieved for an organization. But as Ken describes in this process, the idea that you can use A/B testing for every single small, generally insignificant decision just slows you down and gets in the way of thinking about products as an overall balance of taste and judgment, which need to be built from developing an inbuilt-like response. If you want to learn more, there are 6 hours of interviews with Kenneth Kocienda as well as Richard Williamson from the Computer History Museum on YouTube. Those are linked at the bottom of the blog post. And the blog post also mentions at the bottom some of the other key people, especially from the human interface team, Greg Christie, Ben Ording, Don Milton, Richard Williamson, Imran Chanduri, who are part of the project for human interface design, for the software development, and for the browser projects, as well as Scott Forstall, who ultimately was the high-level manager at this time, right under Steve Jobs, in the demo process.